I'm privileged to welcome my next guest, Chief Ian Campbell, Hereditary Chief of the Squamish Nation. I'll make this introduction short, as Chief Campbell just has so many important things to share with us. I learned a lot. I know you will too. Enjoy this episode with Chief Ian Campbell, Hereditary Chief of the Squamish Nation. Today on Rachel Thexton Connects, in our third season, I am fortunate and honored to have Chief Ian Campbell, the Hereditary Chief of the Squamish Nation, on the podcast. First of all, I'd like to welcome you. Thank you for joining me and for taking the time, Chief Campbell.
Thanks, Rachel. It's my pleasure.
I love having a variety of Indigenous guests on the podcast for selfish reasons, to be honest. I like to ask questions and to learn, and I just feel like I know so little. I feel like my children know more than me and they're school age, and that's embarrassing, and it's not okay. And so I think that anytime that we can have dialogues that offer an opportunity for not only me, but the listeners, of course, to learn, hopefully, and to also, get an idea of, maybe break some myths or stereotypes or stigmas that are associated with certain things, then I jump at that opportunity. So it's just a pleasure to have you on the show, Chief Campbell. I just wanted to start off by asking you, because I know a land acknowledgement is something that is usually done at the beginning of an event or a conference or a meeting even. And I wanted your thoughts on the land acknowledgement. It seems to have become kind of one of those things that people do. And I'm not quite sure how, I don't want to say how invested, but how much kind of thought and care goes into that acknowledgement sometimes, not from the Indigenous community, but from the non-Indigenous community. What are your thoughts on that? Do you have anything to say on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a good thing. In my experience being in politics for, about 25 years, we've seen sort of this curve of elected officials starting to recognize the territories where they work, live, and play. These land acknowledgements are actually part of our Indigenous protocols and laws that we conduct amongst ourselves when we go into someone else's territory. We will always acknowledge, the matriarchs and the chiefs and the people of those lands, and ask permission, basically, to come ashore in our canoes to partake in recognizing their authority, their jurisdiction, their lands in which they've stewarded for innumerable generations. So it's something that we do amongst ourselves. Certainly, it's pretty common around the world. When you go somewhere else, you learn how to introduce yourself, or a greeting or a recognition in Japanese or in Maori or in Spanish. Like wherever you go, you want to sort of conform to some of the local culture and norms in order to show that respect. So it's not isolated, to Canada. I think this is something that we do as humans. When we go to someone else's home, you want to be respectful in their home. And I think a lot of Canadians are doing really good with it. I've seen this, progression. And as you said, it's important to remove the ambiguity that really these are unceded territories. Especially in BC, the dynamics are very complex with, our Aboriginal rights and title not being extinguished. So that underlying sort of ownership is really at the crux of these relationships of recognizing that Indigenous peoples have been here for millennia. And erasure has sort of made that effective to make us invisible in our own land. So land acknowledgements are one way to start correcting that behavior of erasure.
Okay, so the land acknowledgement is definitely a positive thing, and perhaps having some thought and some real detail to it, some context to it, to ensure the person is actually understanding what they're meaning when they say that acknowledgement would be good.
I think like anything, the more it becomes normalized and people feel comfortable, I think we're going to see a progression in those types of acknowledgements. That it's really a celebration of where we are in this part of the world. The history these lands are laden with thousands of years of history. So that land acknowledgement is really a way of celebrating what we all call home, or what we love most, especially here on the West Coast.
Okay, good. So I am on the is it Semiamhu
Yes.
here in South Surrey. And actually, my son is attending a land-based school, and Chief Chappelle, who I believe is the chief of the Semiamhu Nation, is guiding that school's curriculum, which I find really neat. Um, I'm going to jump ahead since we've kind of gotten to that topic about education. I mentioned that my kids know more than me, and I'm not kidding when I say that. And the reason being that we didn't have any curriculum, and not to make excuses, we should have sought out the information. But now it's at least creeping into the education in small ways, progressively. There should be more. And I'm glad that my son will be learning more, but he'll come home and tell me certain things, and I'll be thrilled, or walking through the hallways and seeing the seasons of the year, or the traditional Samiyahu language for the months or the seasons on the wall, or things like that. That's common for them to learn. What are your thoughts on education, and how that kind of really helps to mold a young person into understanding the importance of the culture and various Indigenous nations across our country?
Yeah, for sure. Excellent. So I strongly believe in education as a powerful tool to really influence and to mature as a society here in Canada. I think education plays a pivotal role in how we raise our children to not look at it as us and them, but to look at it as us. Now, this is our shared history, that it doesn't just start with Narvez showing up in our waters, or Captain Vancouver, or Cartier back east. It really starts long before that. And there are many chapters of change and transformation that have occurred on these lands. So I think education is a vehicle to allow young minds to really explore those catalysts of change that, once again is upon us with climate change, with, coming through a pandemic. These are human experiences. So when we look at it through an Indigenous lens, when it comes to relationship to place, as you mentioned, the moons and the cycles of change and rejuvenation, the bounty, those things are now changing because of things like climate change. But it's important to, again, recognize the ecology, the mythology, the social structures and connections that have allowed us to really maintain the beauty and integrity of this part of the world. So education, I worked in the education system for many years before I got into politics. Everything I did throughout my career, when we were negotiating, our fundamental question was, why are we doing this if it's not a path for young people? So creating space and running as a relay runner to pass that baton to the next generation is so important. And your generation, similar to mine, academia really tried to dictate the narrative for Indigenous peoples, and try to perpetuate this myth that all Indigenous peoples, right down to the tip of Tierra del Fuego, came through a one-way door called the Bering Strait. And, that's
Yes.
not our story. We have our own epistemologies, and we have our own truths. And that's a part of reconciliation, is truth and reconciliation. So although the Bering Strait may be a connector for some Indigenous peoples, it certainly doesn't explain the complexity of all of the Americas and the connections throughout the Pacific Rim. All of those connections are being maintained as we reconnect with a lot of Indigenous groups globally. We're resharing our stories and our truths. And I think that's something to celebrate, that our histories and culture rival any other culture, Greek mythology or anything else. But colonization has been dehumanizing Indigenous peoples for hundreds of years, and that has created, unfortunately, a very negative sort of relationship with settlers and Indigenous peoples when it comes to sharing of history. It's really, from a Western colonial point of view, because I'm the first generation out of residential schools, that whole experience, the Canadian experience, was brutal. And it's hard to call them schools, because they're really internment camps. They're really, from an Indigenous lens, it was a foreign invader coming into our lands, abducting our children and forcing them into these internment camps where it wasn't conducive for academia or for affluence in our communities. it was solely designed to eradicate our language and culture and marginalize our people. So there is an undertone that is very sinister when it comes to systemic racism that's directly correlated to education.
I'm sorry that we're jumping ahead so much here, but I just find this interesting. And while I have you here, I have so many questions, and I promise not to keep you longer than I promised. But my question is about so as we're talking about the culture, whenever I'm with, I have two clients who are Indigenous organizations, and I often get to experience and see, hear about, discuss uh, cultures, different cultural traditions that different nations have. And I am blown away. It is so rich. It is so positive. It is so connected with the earth. It is so, it just makes my heart feel warm. That's how it makes me feel. It makes my heart feel warm whenever I'm around someone who is putting. I was in a smudging ceremony the other day, a blanket ceremony, a few other things that I've been involved with, and just hearing about those who have gone up to the mountains and had a time to themselves with the land and the culture. And I would just think that kind of passing that on to youth, young people, and even adults as education, but also as really allowing them to see how rich and how special the culture is. And I by special, I don't mean to minimize it, but I find it just so it is really, really special. And so do you think culture and really kind of incorporating that even into the corporate workplace, teaching people in the workplace would be something that would really bring people information and kind of help them to learn more?
Yeah, I think all of the above, where we utilize every opportunity to showcase the beauty and richness of history and culture, and how it guides us to inform us of relationships and how important it is to build trust, and to see commonalities. Although there are subtle differences throughout Canada when it comes to Indigenous cultures, there's also an underlying value alignment. And when we look at that through a human sort of perspective, we can all relate. And that's the beauty of inviting people to join in a journey or in circles to have experiences. And I do a lot of corporate advisory and sort of workshops and help, share some of that history to build context as to why is economic reconciliation important today. It really just didn't come out of nowhere. It's really this journey that we've been on in the Canadian context. So, I think beginning with young minds, like I have two children, 4-month-old and a 2.5-year-old, and we have them in immersion, to learn our Squamish language. But at the same time, we want to ensure that they have a strong foundation to build success from. And I think that goes for any parent or any culture. You want the best for your next generation. So that word in our language, nokneo, really means a good upbringing. And we have to ask ourselves, well, what does that look like in a modern context? Because a good upbringing in my grandparents' era would have been way different in a sense, with the continuity of tradition from their grandparents connecting back to the 1800s. Today, we live in a different environment, so we have to adapt. And it's really about adaptation versus assimilation. So we're not assimilated people, we simply adapt utilizing the best tools. And I think in sharing that experience, it allows people to broaden their minds on their preconceived images of Indigenous peoples or how they relate to place. I've traveled all over the world, over 40 countries, and I tell people I'm Indigenous, I'm Native. It's not until I do the
Oh my goodness.
you're Indian.
Oh
So
boy.
there's already this image of, sort of Hollywood image, and it is what it is. It's okay. I mean, but those allow opportunities to then dispel some of those myths and really move forward to create some special spaces. So I really enjoy interfacing with other cultures.
Well, I'm glad you take those opportunities to educate people, because there's other reactions you could have. And I think that's one where someone will walk away with, yeah, more knowledge and a little bit less ignorance. So that's great. So back to you, Chief Campbell, how we were set to start this conversation is you are a hereditary chief. You are one of 16 hereditary chiefs of the Squamish Nations. Can you explain to the listeners what it means to be a hereditary chief?
Yeah, certainly. So, being a hereditary chief is through my lineage. So it's our traditional form of governance before sort of the Indian Act was imposed in 1876. We followed our hereditary system until 1981 with the Squamish Nation, and then we had a referendum to switch from a hereditary structure of governance to a 4-year custom term. So I've served 16 years as an elected official. We don't elect our chiefs in the Squamish Nation. All the elected officials are councillors, and we have our chair and co-chair. So really, it was my grandfather, my late grandfather, Lawrence Baker, who was a hereditary chief. He raised me and immersed me and my sister in our language and culture and ceremonies. It was his father, Willie Baker, who was a signatory to our amalgamation in 1923, where the 16 hereditary chiefs and their families ultimately consolidated their assets to collectively form the Squamish Nation. So that's where sort of that catalyst, because we had no legal recourse until 1960, we really had to, find new ways to organize ourselves. Under the Indian Act, we couldn't gather more than 6 natives at any given time without explicit consent from the Indian agents. So to meet and to formulate sort of this unity as hereditary chiefs was a challenge. And it was 10 years in the making. When we were forcibly removed from our villages in downtown Vancouver by 1900. We were deemed as squatters. By 1913, we were being removed from False Creek, all the way through the 30s in Stanley Park. And that experience of being forcibly removed from our homelands necessitated the chiefs to then organize and restructure our governance. So that's where the hereditary chiefs really is about our lineage that connects us back to our responsibilities, to our territories, to our resources, to our families. That created, many different professions in traditional economy. We had, our masons, we had our hunters, our carpenters, our canoe builders. There's just so many different value chains from extraction to manufacturing to trade and commerce that hereditary chiefs and their families were considered smanoth or nobility. Then you had your working class, then you had slaves. So we did have a hierarchy in our communities historically, and it was the nobility that were responsible for mobilizing and organizing the production of sort of economy from our territories. So there's a lot of that history of where hereditary chiefs sort of come from as leadership. And the blanket that we wear. So I don't own the name. My chieftain name is Sokyo, and I'm wearing that name ultimately to pass that on. So my job is to keep that name with integrity and pass that on so that it remains intact. That connection, it's unbroken for innumerable generations. I hope that helps sort of understand a little bit more about, certainly the Squamish's sort of responsibilities as a hereditary chief.
Yes, and so then how will that work? You mentioned you had 2 children. Is one of them a boy?
My 2.5-year-old now is a young boy, Wakaiston. So
Okay.
I'm grooming him to bestow him with sort of that upbringing and teachings and responsibilities. I do have a couple older daughters, and before I had this new boy, I was curious if I was going to wait for a grandchild to pass on to a young boy. I mean, the young women also carry matriarch names in our family, so most people look to the chief as sort of the head of the family, but it's really the grannies. It's really our grandmothers, our ta'as, who are the bosses. So for me, I'm only a spokesperson on behalf of my family. If one of my grannies calls me over and scolds me or tells me what to do, I can't argue. I must listen because they're the authority. And so the young women in the family are Chutlanach. They're the ones that are being groomed as matriarchs to accept those responsibilities. So it's the two together that make a strong sort of unit or family community.
Yes, I always loved that the women, the Indigenous nations seem to have recognized the strength and value of women before the rest of the world did. So I love that.
Well, I had a friendly debate with my mom at one time. I thought I was being cute, and she simply said to me, "You could be replaced. I could make another one of you. Can you do that?" And I was like, "No." So she said,
Wow.
"Well, sit down then." So it humbled me from a young age that the life givers are very special for sure.
That's amazing. Um, so I want to talk for a second about a few minutes about your education and really what you've done here in the city. So I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you were one of the first graduates of Simon Fraser University's MBA in Aboriginal Business and Leadership. And then you went on as a founding partner of MST, which is the negotiations between three nations over land in which you jointly, well, I'll let you explain it. So, can you tell me a little bit about that program, what it provided to you, and also a little bit about MST and how that all works? Because I think people wonder there's, I think $2 billion worth of land there. There's a lot of land. So it's a substantial, undertaking. And also it takes, quite a bit of obviously knowledge and business savvy to manage that.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, the MBA program was absolutely a welcome sort of game changer for me. I was immersed in our traditions from a young age and traveled all over the world. I did some post-secondary at UBC. I did a bunch of, other courses prior to that, Langara and whatnot. But when the MBA program came about, it really resonated with me because I was involved in sort of volume and magnitude of negotiations when it came to acquisition of tree farm licenses or ski hill development of Whistler Blackcomb or LNG projects in the territory, a lot of land development and land use planning. I mean, there was just so much sort of volume that we were, contending with, but also seeing some great metrics of success when it came to creating that space and forging, opportunities and relationships and procurement. So the MBA really complemented sort of where I was at in my career. And I really want to commend SFU for, they're the only post-secondary institute that we're aware of other than in Aotearoa down in New Zealand, where there is an MBA program specific to Indigenous peoples. And in that program, we were the first cohort. So I like to tease SFU and say we were kind of the guinea pigs, but we had access to some really integral case studies, not only in Canada, but US and other international Indigenous groups. And we brought in Dr. Stephen Cornell from Harvard, who did 30 years of analysis through the Harvard Project to look at different Indigenous nations, primarily in the Americas, and distinguishing what has allowed them to become successful. And it was really those nations that adhere to their values. They're not just in business for the sake of business, but there's purpose and profit. And that profit is sort of distributed into our programs and services, into our communities, language revitalization, elders care, youth programs, recreation. There's things that other governments will never pay for that nations need to create that ongoing concern of revenues and assets. So that sort of experience through the MBA allowed me to then focus my main sort of project, the thesis on the MST experience, because that was a live issue that, at first was very disheartening to sit in the room and to see the three families in a place of competition over scarcity resources, where we've been into our own little reserves, our own little fractions of our territory, that we had to reframe those relationships, reaffirming our kinship ties in our longhouse. That then allowed us to create a protocol agreement that was very narrow in scope. It was focused solely on dispositions of lands that are claimed by the Crown within our territories. There's no such thing as Crown land. They're all lands that the Crown has sort of come in and superimposed their Western sort of regime over, but we're still here. So it's this competition, not only amongst ourselves as Indigenous, but then Indigenous Crown relations. So the MBA allowed me to look at business principles to forge The relationship between the three families as equal partners, 33.3% each. We had to then present that back to our own leadership in our communities, which we garnered significant feedback. Why are we sharing, or why are we buying back our lands? Because these lands didn't come back for free. We had to negotiate acquisitions that were
Wow.
in the hundreds of millions of dollars. And we have choice. Do you want to wait for treaty? Do you want to exercise, litigation? Do you want to negotiate? Do you want to exercise civil disobedience? Or do you want to be complacent and do nothing? We had to weigh all of our options, and negotiation and acquisition to purchase a portion of the lands created stability and certainty for us to get an ROI on that in the future, that we recognize the value of these lands in a global context. The demand for these lands will never go away. They will only increase exponentially, especially when it comes to the housing market or industrial projects to get product to Tidewater to access global markets. The West Coast is an integral part of that ongoing economic driver for Canada. So we felt purchasing a portion of our lands through an MST partnership allowed us to then certainly borrow against creating relationships with investors and with development partners, along with the city and other regulatory processes, to then look at how are we putting these lands forward as a part of the solution of affordability here in Vancouver. Rental is brutal. Occupancy rates are very 1% or something, like it's. So we wanted to then contribute these lands, not just for the benefit of the MST, but how does that fit into sort of the general market of transportation and living and daycare and all the affordability issues that we face on a daily basis. So we are creating a lot of rental products, a lot of social housing, but of course market housing to be able to pay for the ongoing phases and development of these lands. We do have a good relation with the city of Vancouver, where they recognize that we're contributing to affordability. So there's a lot of partnerships that have forged as a result of us creating those partnerships in space. Our protocol agreement with the nations really wasn't intended to solve all issues between the three families, Musqueam, Squamish, Saulteaux. So we didn't tackle ports, we didn't tackle gaming or fisheries or other issues. It was simply about land development.
Wow. What an undertaking. I can only imagine. And it seems that there is a lot that the average person does not know about this. I mean, we see, a short article in the Vancouver Sun or wherever it may be. But there's a lot more to this than the average person, even corporate professional would know about how this all works and how it was developed.
Well, it's interesting because the nations, simply my parents' era, weren't allowed to own private land.
Mhm.
As Indigenous status Indians in Canada under the Indian Act, we couldn't own fee simple land till post 1960. So while other Canadians have been buying, developing, and flipping lands for a very long time, creating substantive generational wealth, Indigenous peoples were completely shut out of those opportunities and markets. So this is really our first kick at the can to really develop lands both on and off reserve. So ultimately, we're new entrants in the market in a sea of development, and we're going to get feedback no matter what we do. Some people will agree, some people will disagree, some people don't care, but we have to recognize that this is a significant opportunity, a moment in time for Canada. If we look at John Ralston Saul's book, A Fair Country, we start to look at the opportunity to mature as a society and to recognize that we're in this together. So, Indigenous peoples entering the market to do major projects in the billions of dollars. Yes, it's a curve. Nothing's a straight line. We're going to hit peaks and valleys along the way. But ultimately, we're on a trajectory that's going to provide a lot of solutions and success for many generations to come.
Fantastic. Well, whenever I see anything, I always read it, and I might be shooting you off some emails asking some questions.
Yes, please.
I hope you don't
hesitate.
mind.
Of course.
So when we talk, you've mentioned elders. I understand that you had your grandparents and other mentors who are elders in your life, and I wanted to talk about that for a second. Sometimes elders, meaning grandparents or great grandparents, are a part of our lives and culture in a big way, and sometimes not. We're a diverse province, so depends on the culture, the family, etc. I would think that would be incredibly important. Who is more wise than those who have lived, more years and have more knowledge and have gathered more experiences? And I'm just wondering, growing up with this, this blessing of elders around you, could you share a couple of the key learnings that you've gathered from elders throughout your life that you really, that really you feel are so valuable to you today?
Yeah, very nice. I keep my mentors very close to my heart, and I'm tremendously grateful. Starting with my late grandparents, June and Lawrence Baker, who raised, me and my sister from a very young age. My grandfather went to residential schools in Seashelt and shared a lot of the atrocities that he was subjected to, along with my parents, have been very generous in sharing their experiences through residential school and day school. And my grandfather was really the cultural leader in our family who immersed us. And I was an obedient student. I didn't really question him. I didn't really seek clarification when he spoke. I basically listened, but there was always this sort of gnawing in the back of my mind, going, "But why?" Or what does that mean? Like I wanted to delve deeper, and the influence that my grandparents had on me was very strong, where they talked about other people that are Coast Salish or other tribes that are respected knowledge keepers or elders, and their influence to meet Chief Chester Moore from the Nisga'a Nation, or Bilby Tom from down in Swinomish, or not Swinomish, the Skagit Valley, and others, that Dominic Point in Musqueam. When I finally had a chance to meet these elders, I immediately had a love and a respect for them. And then they in turn showed me great respect, and they said, "Please come. We know that you're the grandson of Chief Lawrence Baker, and you've been raised, with traditions." They sort of took me under their wing. And when I sat with these elders, I was basically in my 20s and they're in their 80s, and we became like best friends. Like I just wanted to go and hang with them. And I thought I was good and I knew something, and I'd pick up my drum and sing an old song, and the elder would basically sit down, like I'll sing it the way I know it, and they'd sing it, and I would just be like in awe because they were there as children when those old timers did it. So there was this generational connection. And they weren't easy on me. They would call me on my BS, and and I needed that sort of tough love. Often I would ask one of those elders a question, and they would answer me with a story. And I often wondered, like, where are they going with this? And do they have their hearing aid on? Did they hear me properly? It's as I went through life experience and my own trials and tribulations, a lot of their words came back and sort of had that lasting impact. Initially when they would say stuff, I didn't quite get it when I was younger. It kind of went over me. And for example, I had an elder, Lillian Pitawanakwat from Birch Island. She's an Anishinaabe elder. So one day I asked Lillian, why are Indigenous peoples meant to go through so much turmoil and strife as a result of colonialism and our modern sort of abject poverty and negative statistics? And she looked at me and sternly said, "Who are you to question the creator?" And I was just like, wow, okay. I never thought of it that way. And I had nothing else to say other than to try and allow that to impact. And it humbled me,
Mhm.
and then I went to Tibet, and I was with His Holiness, the 33rd Minri Trezin, the head abbot of the Bonpo religion. And the last thing, when I left Tibet, when we accompanied him there, I wanted him to give me something. I'm like, look, like I just wanted him to touch me and heal me and ease my pain or something. And he looked at me and he said, "Suffering is necessary." And it wasn't at all what I wanted to hear.
No.
And, I thought, wow, thanks, thanks a lot. And I came home and I told my mom, like, what His Holiness said to me. And she said it was brilliant. She said, if someone else doesn't cause you suffering, you'll do it to yourself. And if you don't do it to yourself, you'll walk down the street and a branch will fall out of the tree and hit you on the head. No, sorry to, but you know what I mean? Like in
Yes.
one way or another, we will, as a human experience, suffer in order to allow us to truly find love and peace and all those other things. So there were so many deep teachings
Yes.
that these elders shared with me in their wisdom that I carry with me, and they become sort of my founding sort of principles, or my compass, if you will.
So growth, a lot of growth through suffering.
Yes, I mean it's still hard to understand, so you want to affect positive change and do something about it. What are we going to do? We do have choices. So it's how you sort of dust yourself off and get back up and continue climbing the mountain is really important. You don't just lay down, like get up and move.
And get up again.
Yes.
Yeah, no, that's great. Um, so I wanted to, as I've been speaking with, a variety, it was actually Wade Grant from Musqueam Nation who really brought this point home to me. And that is that, he is a Musqueam man, as you are a Squamish man. And often people will just kind of umbrella non-Indigenous people, umbrella the Indigenous peoples together as one. And there are, I don't know how many, between 80 and 100 different nations across Canada, something along those lines, all with different cultures and histories and traditions and such. And so I'm just wondering your thoughts on that, and also anything about the Squamish Nation specifically that you want to highlight during our discussion.
So I was once told that Canada has 11 major language families. And I kind of look to it as those are the nations. It's the dialects within a language family that connect people to a common sort of history and culture. So I was also told that out of the 11 language families in Canada, seven of them are in British Columbia. So BC is very diverse when it comes to comparing Salish languages, that Musqueam and Squamish are dialects of Salish. If you compare that to Haida or Nishka, it's like comparing Japanese to German. It's just completely different. So the diversity is beautiful when it comes to the bounty of the land that allowed people to really develop ornate and complex cultures and ceremonies because of the bounty of salmon or other resources that allowed us to really then develop intricate ceremony, basically. So, if you look at Squamish and Musqueam, because I am half Musqueam, my dad is Musqueam, my mom is Squamish, we're really family, and it's the Indian Act that separated us and segregated us. So, under the Indian Act, Canada created 633 First Nations in Canada. They're not all nations in their own right. They're a part of a larger family. So if
Yes.
you look at Musqueam and Squamish, they're a part of the Coast Salish language family that's actually dissected in half by the Canada-US border. So we have a lot of relatives all through Washington State, a lot of relatives down through Oregon, to Northern California, and then a large chunk of southwestern British Columbia. This is sort of geographically Coast Salish territory. So we'd be sort of the Salish nation. And then you have the interior Salish, which go to Montana and the Okanagan and Shuswap and up into Lillooet and Lytton, the Statland people. They all speak interior Salish, so they're very similar to coastal Salish. Like we can understand a lot of their language, their words. So there's a connection of Salish people. And if you look at that in North America, that's a pretty large geographic area of Coast Salish and interior Salish that transcends in transboundary. So, Squamish, we call ourselves Squamish Nation because we amalgamated in 1923. Our hereditary chiefs collectively formed the nation. But I think it's a bit of a misnomer because it's all English. It's really how do we identify ourselves in our own languages and our own identity? I would say my ancestral name is Cholip. I come from the village of Slaan here in North Vancouver. My lineage comes from the Squamish and Musqueam people. And those ancestral names for traditional people would know they connect you to villages and to families and nations. So we're all connected. We have cousins everywhere. We have hundreds of cousins on the island and up the valley and down the states through kinship ties. So really, that's our family. And yes, I mean, I'm staunchly proud of being Musqueam and Squamish, but I also feel a part of a broader family.
So the border really is kind of irrelevant when it comes to, as you think of the land as it should be, when it comes to, the US Canada border. I mean, I don't mean it's irrelevant, but in the sense that the lands do kind of, they they share both
Imposition,
Canadian. Yeah.
for sure, a modern imposition, but you know, there's always a catalyst of change in all of our mythology. We have a common sort of thread of tricksters, and the trickster is alive and well. The trickster is omnipresent. The trickster is within each of us.
Mm.
So we can't act as though the trickster is something external. It's also within ourselves. And when we look at this dissecting of our families with the imposition of the Canada-US border, it really just represents a modern sort of trickster that is separating our families. And that's not a new story. We talked about that with the mythological times of Sanutkai, the double-headed serpent. You can kind of see over my shoulder here. This serpent kind
Yes.
of blocked our families from north to south in the mythology. And it wasn't until we were able to, our mythological hero slayed the dragon or the serpent, that our people reconnected again. So we're finding today we're starting to reconnect with indigenous peoples around the not only the Salish Sea but the Pacific Rim, and we're starting to look towards a post-colonial era where, as you said, with education and other tools of economy and whatnot, we're coming back to sort of our traditions in a modern context.
Would you compare the word trickster or the concept of trickster in some ways to sin or devil, or the religious context of Christianity? Would it be somewhat similar?
That's a good question because to be candid, I don't know a lot about Christianity
Hmm.
or comparables with the mythology associated. But yeah, definitely a trickster is often in Squamish mythology personification of someone like Mink or Raven as these characters that are often the instigators or the ones who trigger a series of events that they themselves may be completely unaware of what they set into motion, but the consequences of their actions can really cause chaos, which
Mm.
ultimately then brings change and rejuvenation and a new beginning and transformation then occurs. So you could look at them as being, in a sense, dark or evil because they had done things that have caused harm and have been destructive. Similar to the Thunderbird, bringing chaos and storming and major events. After that comes new beginnings and sort of this transformation that occurs. So I don't know if I can qualify it enough to answer your question, other than sort of how I look to the trickster as also being within each of us, because how we think, how we look, how we speak, how what we do in our actions can, we have the ability to create beauty or destruction, and it's often a perilous sort of tightrope we walk.
Yes, I would say I am a Christian myself, and I would say they sound very similar in the sense that in all of us, we have that, and we all go down one road or the other at different points in our life. And so it sounds very, but I hadn't heard that term before. So you've already taught me. I've got stars beside a few things that
Nice.
I've learned so much already. So thank you, Chief Campbell. Um, I appreciate it. Just a couple more questions for you. About this one is about the land. And I think this one is really, really important. I'd love to hear your response to this. So, there was a study that was done in early 2024. I think it was approximately 60% of Indigenous peoples in Canada felt that they had been discriminated against. They had experienced discrimination in the workplace, and Indigenous talent, I think, is very underutilized. And I'm wondering about this in connection with the land. So we have, climate issues. We have, changes in how our seasons are. We never used to see snow in Vancouver. Now every year we have snow. Um, we can debate, all of us can debate as to what's going on with climate change, but I think we can all agree things are changing. And the land, there are many professions within it, whether it be on the water, on the land itself, in the sky. And I understand from speaking with you and other Indigenous peoples that the connection with the land is very much a part of your culture and history and knowledge. So it seems to me that that would be a natural fit for someone who was interested to work in a profession that was connected with the environment and the land, and that is just a natural, wow, what a bonus to have somebody who has that connection and knowledge. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Throughout my career in negotiations and intergov, we tried to create space, and as I mentioned earlier, to create a path for young people in a variety of sectors. And when I came into the nation in 1999, back in the 1900s, um, my first sort of task was to help develop our High land use plan. So, we really then canvassed our community, our families, our youth, our elders to garner their input on what is our vision for our lands and territories. And then part of that entailed how much, like doing inventory, how much of our territory has been already impacted at the hands of Western management practices. So we recognized huge parts of our territory has been privatized. A lot of it is in flood torrent hazards, so future development or opportunities for treaty settlement becomes diminished. It really became very complex. So we had to look back to our traditions and say, where are areas that are important to us through mythology, ecology, hunting, fishing, gathering, village sites, burial sites, just kind of looking at the territory through more of an analytical lens as a government to then start creating polygons where we then protected 8% of the territory, 50,000 hectares, as what we call which is really hard to say in English or translate it. So we settled on conservancies, where we also then did the acquisition of TFL 38 to create jobs and value chains for young people that want to be in the forestry sector. We did 9 clean energy projects to look at the responsible use of our systems that are conducive for that type of development that aren't spiritual or fish sort of habitat. One of the best examples I can think of is our independent environmental assessment on wood fiber LNG export facility, where the proponent came to us and wanted to build this export facility in our village of Swayat, which is known as wood fiber. We said, well, why should we? Like, what should we look at? And we said, we're not going to go cap in hand to some other level of government. So we opted to do our own independent environmental assessment, where again, it was years of consultation with our members to hear their concerns and then to formulate 25 legally binding conditions for the proponents. These conditions then affected design changes for the project, such as seawater cooling. They initially wanted to draw in millions of gallons of seawater daily from Howe Sound, heat it and chlorinate it and put it back in water. This was a non-starter for us, so we invited them to look at the feasibility of air cooling technology, to look at net zero as well as the electrification of the project to avoid the Squamish River estuary sensitive habitat, removing compressor stations away from our inhabited reserves. There's a number of sort of conditions that we felt met our metrics to then garner consent on a project, which is United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People. A component of that is free, prior, informed consent. So we wanted to actualize consent and develop a process that has integrity, a start and finish, a conclusion based off of solid analysis that's weighed in accordance to our values of our relationship to our territory. So that allowed us to garner consent and provide that on a project like wood fiber. But in saying that, what informed me of those processes was being out on the land my whole life, being out on the sound, continuing to hunt, excuse me, and fish and mountaineer and camp and recreate, and excuse me, going to some of the most remote parts of our territory. It's truly an honor to be able to visit those sacred spaces.
Okay. Yes, it seems as though there are a variety. I work with Access, and they're a great group actually based in West Vancouver, helping to support urban Indigenous peoples with employment, education, etc. And they do a fantastic job. But a lot of their programming is trades. They also have some that is related to the land, such as Bridge Watch, a partnership with BCIT, which is small vessels, large vessels. And this kept coming back to me in my mind, is this connection between land and the knowledge of land and those professions in which people are learning through their degree, but they may not have those extra bits of expertise that someone such as yourself would have, having been on the land and having the connection with it. So that makes sense. What is the next step for you, Chief Campbell? You have accomplished a lot to date. Congratulations for everything that you've done. I mean, it's been a information sharing, giving back to your nation and others via the work that you've done for economic development in the city. You're always very gracious with sharing information and educating those who are non-Indigenous. Just being on the podcast is an example of that. I've seen you in other places do the same. But I'd love to know, are there any goals that you'd really like to achieve, in the near future, something you have on in your mind?
Yeah, certainly. So I'm happy that I sort of did my part for 25 years in leadership for Squamish and for this country. I feel like it really built a lot of relationships um, to really propel us forward. And when I opted not to run for re-election the last term, I felt good in my heart and mind that it was time to sort of pass that baton and to seek new adventures, new endeavors. And really, what compelled me was throughout my life, I had seen a lot of great political leaders. I mentioned Ovid Mercredi earlier, who mentored me from a young age when he was national chief, and Frank Calder and James Gosnell with Anishka are two leaders I witnessed as a youth speaking about Aboriginal title. And Robert Davidson, a renowned height artist, had a lot of influence on me growing up, seeing him drumming, singing, speaking his language, and carving such beautiful sculptures. So I'd seen a lot of political leaders, I'd seen a lot of cultural leaders, and I had been involved in the curve on both of those fronts as well, with revitalization of language and song and regalia and stories. But I haven't seen enough business leaders. When I did the Chinook program out at UBC Sauder, I met Dave Tucker for the first time, and he really inspired me on his story, his journey to become a successful Indigenous businessman in Canada. And when I look at other groups in Canada that are doing well, like Member 2 First Nations Chief Terry Paul, I have great respect for someone like Chief Paul, for his leadership and his vision and his commitment to excellence, basically quality. And you have Robert Louis up in West Bank, you have Clarence Louis and Osoyoos. There's a handful of leaders, but I wanted to see more business leaders, because if I look at the value of my lands in a global context here on the West Coast, those lands, you mentioned $2 billion of value for our 120 acres or so. But if you look at the entirety of my territory and the flow that's going through, and the reality that most of my family members have been in abject poverty, not by accident, but by design from Canada, I wanted to change that. So my next focus is really implementation to bring projects to fruition where there's significant procurement opportunities and partnerships for careers for our young people that choose to enter trades, pre-development, development, construction, operations, really anything within the value chains. I want to attract and retain the best and brightest when it comes to our young people. And we have 4,000 members in the nation today, 60% being youth, approximately that amount being under 25. So you have a huge cohort of young people, and it's pretty much the same across Canada with the demographics of Indigenous being largely youth. So you have a huge cohort of young people that are raw talent, and they need mentors. They need connections and introductions to senior subject matter experts in any sector. And when you have your MBA or law degree, you should be able to perform in corporate Canada anywhere. And we need to prove that. We need to show tangible results of success. So really my focus is on business and continuing to forge, opportunities for not only Squamish members, but all of our families here, including urban Indigenous, to participate in the growth of business in Canada.
Okay, maybe a leadership business course of some type that you can host. I don't know. I think it would draw great interest.
Yeah, no, I mean, I do a lot of work with UBC and SFU, and I'm always happy to come in and co kind of what do you call present and do all that stuff, and it's fun. I enjoy meeting cohorts from every walk, international, local, domestic. I mean, it's all fun to be able to interface with people and really share stories. That's all we're doing is telling stories, and a lot of what I share really isn't my words. They're words I heard from my elders that I'm simply trying to honor and do the best I can to keep that alive and pass it on to hopefully inspire others. So yeah, if I can ever continue in that regard, that's really that's something that matters and makes a difference to me.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you, Chief Campbell. I ask every guest at the end of our conversation if they would like to highlight any one or two local nonprofits. Is there one or two that you, especially close to you, that you would like to mention today?
Absolutely. What comes to mind immediately is Protect Our Indigenous Sisters. This is really addressing the murdered and missing Indigenous women in this country. That is still a huge issue. As an Indigenous person, we all know somebody who's gone missing and has been murdered, and that has to change. The complacency of government and law enforcement on those matters, and for that matter of Canadians, has been very disheartening to see that continue to this day. So Protect Our Indigenous Sisters, I believe, is the name of the organization. It's a not-for-profit. They do a lot of good work. And the other one, of course, is Indian Residential School Survivor Society. As they move forward and really support the trauma, the intergenerational trauma that has impacted so many Indigenous peoples with the taking of our continents and of our lands and our culture and our identities. That colonial violence is very real, and we need to transition through that. And I see a lot of progress in that regard, such as yourself having me share and feel safe to be able to share these ideas and dynamics. So Indigenous or Indian Residential School Survivor Society does a lot of work and certainly support the work that they do. So those are a couple that immediately come to mind.
Perfect. I'll make sure to link to those and connect people with them via social media channels. Thank you for sharing that. One quick little thing, Chief Campbell, if you don't mind, I'm having trouble pronouncing my son's school. And I'm wondering if you can help me with that.
Yeah.
I think it's pronounced Wapitung, but I'm not sure about that. And I don't know if you're familiar with the school, but it is spelled XW apostrophe EPITENG. And I think it's pronounced Wapitung. Am I correct with that?
Yeah, the XW would be a kind of a blowing sound.
Okay.
Wapitung.
So
It sounds like
Wapitung.
Wapitung or Wapitung. I think that's in the Hunkaminam dialect, which is my dad's dialect. I don't know that word specifically, but it sounds like Wapitung. Wapitung.
I can send you the spelling of it as well, because I know I just popped that on you out of surprise. But yes, it is a non-Indigenous person who answers the phone. And so that's why she's saying Wapitung. So more of a comes from the throat. Wapitung. I don't know.
That's it.
I'm
Yes, you got it.
trying.
That's perfect. You can tell we ate a lot of salmon because it's like a salmon bone is stuck in our throat. Wapitung.
It's hard. It's very challenging. But thank you so much for being here today. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and your elders' knowledge, your grandparents' knowledge, for answering these questions. I really truly do appreciate it, and I'm honored that you have been a guest on my podcast. So I'm wishing you all the best and hope to have you on again soon.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rachel.
Thank you.
Be kind and truly connect. You're listening to Rachel Thexton Connects.